There is a man at the center of the entire Yellowstone story that almost nobody talks about. Not the one fighting off developers in Montana. Not the one who crossed the country in a wagon in 1883. There is a man who stands exactly between those two worlds, and the show barely gives him a full scene. His name is John Dutton II, and the year he was born tells you everything about why this family is the way it is. That year is 1944. And once you understand what that year really means, every single thing you thought you knew about the Duttons is going to look completely different. Asterisk, most people who watch Yellowstone are focused on John Dutton III. He is the one on screen. He is the one making hard decisions, burying his children, fighting politicians, and holding onto that ranch with both hands like it is the last solid thing in the world. And that makes sense because he is the main character. But here is the thing about main characters. They do not build themselves. Something builds them. Someone builds them. And in John III's case, that someone is a man the show keeps almost completely in the shadows. John Dutton II is treated by the show like a background detail. You hear his name. You catch a mention here and there. You see the weight of him on John III's face every time the old man talks about what the ranch means and what it cost. But you never really get to sit with John II as a person. You never get to understand where he came from, what shaped him, or what kind of world he was born into. The show gives you just enough to feel his presence and then moves on. And most viewers move on too. That is the mistake. Because the moment you stop and actually ask the question, who was John Dutton II and what was happening when he came into this world? Everything about the Yellowstone story snaps into focus in a way it never did before. The anger that John III carries makes more sense. The obsession with the land makes more sense. The way he treats his children. The way he talks about legacy. The way he seems to believe that losing the ranch would be the same as dying. All of it makes more sense when you understand the man who raised him and the world that man was born into. So let us go back. Not to 1883 and the wagon trails, not to the modern-day battles in the Montana State House. Let us go to the exact middle point between those two worlds. Let us go to 1944. Because that is where the real Dutton story begins, not with a pioneer crossing a river and not with a rancher arguing with a governor. It begins with a baby born into one of the hardest years in American history, on a piece of land that the whole world was conspiring to take away. To a family that had already lost so much and somehow refused to let go, that baby grew up to raise John Dutton III, and that fact alone should tell you that 1944 is not a small detail. It is the whole story. Asterisk, the year is 1944, somewhere in the cold fields of Montana. A child takes his first breath. There are no celebrations loud enough to cut through the noise of the world outside. Because in 1944, the entire world is on fire. Young men are dying on beaches in France. Mothers are opening letters they never wanted to read. Factories that used to make cars are now making tanks. And the America that John Dutton II was born into was not the land of opportunity people love to talk about. It was a land holding its breath, waiting to find out if it was going to survive. This matters more than most people realize. When you are born into a time of war, the war does not stay on the battlefield. It comes home. It sits at the dinner table. It shows up in what your family can and cannot afford. It changes what your father talks about and what he refuses to talk about. The men who were supposed to be working the land were overseas fighting. The ones who stayed behind were working twice as hard with half the help and on a ranch in Montana. That kind of pressure did not just make life harder. It made life feel like something that could be taken from you at any moment without warning. Ranching families in 1944 were not living the romantic cowboy life that movies like to sell. They were struggling in ways that most people today would find hard to imagine. The federal government had its hands in everything during the war years. Land policies were shifting. Resources were being directed toward the war effort, and families who had built their lives on wide open land suddenly found themselves answering to people in distant offices who had never once set foot on a working ranch. The Duttons were not unique in facing this pressure, but they felt it the same as everyone. Else, maybe more. Because the Duttons had already paid for that land in blood going back generations, and now strangers with briefcases were deciding what it was worth and what could be done with it. A child growing up in that environment does not learn that the world is a safe place. He learns the opposite. He learns that what your family has can disappear. He learns that the land is not just where you live, but what keeps you alive. And that there are always people somewhere who want to take it. He learns to hold on. He learns to distrust. He learns that softness is something you cannot afford when everything around you is built on the edge of collapse. John Dutton II absorbed all of that before he ever said his first full sentence. And when he grew up and had a son of his own, he passed every single one of those lessons down without even trying. That son was John III, and now suddenly the man we see on screen starts to make a different kind of sense. Asterisk here is something the show does that most viewers never catch. It does not hide John Dutton II. It just never shines a light on him long enough for you to really see him. Every time he comes up in conversation, the camera moves on. Every time John III mentions his father, it is in the middle of something else, something bigger, something louder. And that is not an accident. That is a writing choice. Because if you sat with John II long enough to truly understand him, the mystery of John III would dissolve completely. And Taylor Sheridan does not want that mystery to dissolve. He wants you to feel the ghost of that man without ever fully meeting him. He wants John II to haunt the show the same way he haunted his son. But ghosts leave. Traces, and if you pay close enough attention to everything the show gives you, even the small throwaway lines, even the pauses in conversation, even the way John III's face changes when certain subjects come up, you can start to build a picture of who John II actually was. And that picture is not a comfortable one. This was not a warm man. This was not a man who sat his son down and talked about feelings. This was a man who was forged in 1944. Who grew up watching the land get threatened from every direction. Who learned that survival was the only language that mattered. And he raised his son in that same language. Not because he was cruel. Because it was the only way he knew how to love. The birth of John Dutton II sits at the exact crossing point of two massive forces. On one side you have the pioneer legacy coming down from 1883, all that sacrifice and blood and crossing of impossible distances just to plant a flag on a piece of Montana earth. On the other side you have the modern world pressing in, the government, the developers, the changing face of America that had no patience for men who still believed the land was sacred. John II was born right in the middle of those two forces. He never got to be just a person. From the moment he arrived in 1944, he was a bridge. A link in a chain that started with James Dutton on a wagon trail and ended with John III standing in a field refusing to move. And here is what the show wants you to forget. It wants you to think of John III as the beginning of the story. It frames him that way. It gives him the spotlight. It makes his pain feel like the original pain, but it is not. His pain is inherited. His stubbornness is inherited. His belief that the ranch is worth dying for is not something he came up with on his own. It was handed to him by a man who was handed it by the generation before that. John Dutton II is the hidden middle chapter of a story that spans over 100 years. And without understanding that chapter, you are only reading half the book. Asterisk, think about what it means to hand something broken to someone you love. Not broken like a cracked cup that you can glue back together. Broken like a foundation that has hairline cracks running through every wall. Cracks so small you cannot see them until the whole structure starts to lean. That is what John Dutton II handed to his son. Not a ranch, not a legacy. A beautiful, painful, crumbling thing that looked like strength from the outside, but was held together by sheer will and nothing else. And the reason it was that way goes all the way back to the year he was born and the world that shaped him before he was old enough to understand what the world was doing to him. When you are raised by a man who came of age in 1944, you are raised by someone who never learned that peace was possible. The men and women of that generation did not trust calm moments. Calm moments were what happened right before something terrible arrived, so they stayed ready. They stayed hard. They built walls around everything they cared about, and they taught their children to build walls too. John Dutton III did not develop his edge on his own. He was given it. It was pressed into him the same way you press a shape into wet clay, slowly, consistently, every single day until the clay dries and the shape becomes permanent and you cannot imagine it ever being any other way. This is why 1944 is the final piece of the puzzle, because it explains the inheritance in a way that nothing else does. People watch Yellowstone and they see a man who loves his land too much, who holds on too tight, who pushes his children to breaking point. Who would rather die on that ranch than live anywhere else? And they try to explain it through the modern storylines. They blame the developers. They blame the politics. They blame the personal tragedies John III has lived through. But those are not the root. Those are the branches. The root is a man born in a year when America was at war and Montana ranches were hanging by a thread. A man who grew up believing that relaxing your grip for even 1 second meant losing everything. And who poured that belief into his son like water poured into a mold. Taylor Sheridan did not pick 1944 by accident. No detail in this universe is accidental. He picked that year because it sits at the perfect intersection of American history and Dutton family mythology. A child born in 1944 grows up in the shadow of the war, comes into his own in the uncertain 1960s, raises a family in the turbulent decades that follow, and passes on a worldview that was never allowed to soften because the world never gave it a reason to. That child becomes the missing link between the romantic pioneer story of 1883 and the modern battlefield of Yellowstone. He's the reason the fire kept burning. He is the reason John III is who he is, and now that you know that, every scene, every argument, every quiet moment where John III stands alone looking out at that land carries a weight it did not carry before. That weight has a name. It has a history. And it started in 1944.